Mr. Raymond Chamboko, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the event today on IFRS 9, expected credit losses. And it is my honor to welcome Mr. Raymond Chamboko to present today. Mr. Raymond Chamboko is a Johannesburg registered IFRS advisor. He is director at W Consulting. Raymond has been involved in IFRS implementation projects for Johannesburg Stock Exchange listed and public interest entities for a number of years. For those of you who are not familiar, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange has a market capitalization of $1.28 trillion. It is in the top 20 stock exchanges by market capitalization. Mr. Chamboko has also consulted to the World Bank on capacity building on IFRS skills. He is a co-author of the publication Applying IFRS for SMEs, which is sitting on my desk at this very moment. And Mr. Chamboko is also co-author of the internationally renowned Wiley Interpretation and Application of International Financial Reporting Standards. Raymond is a member of the IFRS Foundation's Small and Medium-Sized Entities Implementation Group, the ISB's Accounting Standards Advisory Forum, and of the Reporting Investigations Panel of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Mr. Chamboko, thank you very much for sharing your valuable time with us. I would like to let you know that IFRS 9 for commercial banks in Cambodia, IFRS 9 was made mandatory for periods beginning 1 January 2019. So in our jurisdiction, our professionals only have a few years of experience, and we are still learning and developing our knowledge in this area. And we very much value you sharing your skills and your knowledge with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Casey. Thank you very much, everybody. I was going to try and greet you all in Khmer this afternoon. So let me try and see if I can get the pronunciation right. And then everything just goes completely odd. Soste Pelosiel. Good afternoon to everybody. I hope I did not mangle that too much. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some information around IFRS 9 financial instruments impairments specifically. And as we go along, I think as you've experienced in these sessions, happy for you to type any questions that you might have in the chat function. As we go along, I will see what I can do to try and address those questions. I think there will be quite a lot of us on the call this afternoon, so it is possible that I may miss some questions. If I do, please forgive me, but I will do my best to try and keep one eye on what's going on in the chat function. If there's any questions that are in there that are pertinent to whatever it is that I'm talking about, I may address them at that point. If you find that I don't address your question immediately, don't despair. You may find that in what I'm talking about as I go along, the question might come up or the response might come up in what I then do a little bit later on through the session. Right, so before I get started, I think let me see if I can share my screen with you. And Casey, if you don't mind just letting me know once you can see my screen, then I know that I can carry on. Casey, if you can just confirm for me that you can see it.
Yes, we see you.
Excellent, thank you very much. All right, so let's get started then. Just want to clear a few things here. I've got a few things that are popping up that shouldn't be there. Let's get rid of that. And we get rid of this one now. Apologies. Okay, I think we might have to live with the one that's right on the top. For some reason, I'm not able to get rid of that one, but okay, anyway. Let's move on from there. All right, so what we'll do this morning is that we will do a little bit of a recap of what is happening, what is sitting in IFRS 9, very brief. Given that I think, you like Casey said, you started applying IFRS 9 in the recent past, this should not be completely brand new territory for you. So I'll have a question that I'm going to ask you just now, just to get a sense as to how much we know about IFRS 9. But today we want to focus on the financial assets side of things. And in focusing on the financial assets side of IFRS 9, this is where impairments come in. Effectively, once we've created a debtor, or we've raised a loan, or we've issued a loan to a third party, they've borrowed money from us, we are sitting with a debtor on our books. We need to account for that receivable in our books. And in accounting for that receivable, if you've given that money to me, you've lent that money to Raymond, you may find that, well, the person that you lent the money to, their credit quality, their credit history has deteriorated since you lent it to them. Never mind, even if it has not deteriorated since you lent it to them. But the fact of the matter is that you have lent money to a third party. There is a possibility, and I'm choosing my words carefully here. There is a possibility that they may not be able to pay us back in full. So therefore, IFRS 9 then says to us, well, go and make a provision against a particular receivable, against that particular debtor, in anticipation of this possibility that they may not be in a position to pay you back. That's effectively what the standard says to us. So right off the bat, we're making provisions. So folks, we'll look at like I said, recap of what is sitting in IFRS 9. We'll have a look at impairments and expected credit losses and how those will potentially have an impact on what we're doing. And then what we'll then do from there is that we will then go into, we'll then have a look at some case studies as well as we go along, just to give you a sense as to what are the sorts of things that, how would one approach the whole impairment process, the whole making a provision for expected credit losses in our books. So to get us started, I'd like for you to, if you got a phone or you've got a device that can scan, if you can whip out your phones for a moment, and if you can scan on the QR code that is coming up, I'd like for you to be able to answer this question that I've put up in front of you now. So if you don't have access, if you don't have a device that can scan, what you can do is that you can go to paulev.com/golden window 397. If you can go there, then that will allow you to respond to this. And if you can choose one of these for me for a moment, I'd like to see what your responses would be. Which of the following categories, which of the following are categories of financial assets under IFRS 9? Good. A, fair value through profit or loss, fair value through other comprehensive income and amortized cost. B, fair value through profit or loss, fair value through other comprehensive income and available for sale and amortized cost. C, fair value through profit or loss, available for sale, held to maturity, loans and receivables. D, fair value, available for sale, amortized cost. Or is it E, none of the above? Let me know what your thoughts are. Okay, I can see the results starting to come in. Thank you. Just one person so far. Sure, we can do a lot better than that. I think while you guys are trying to do that, let me see if I can get rid of this thing here. Oh, there we go. I can get rid of it. All right, folks. There are a lot more than 7 of us on the call this morning. We should be able to do a lot better than this. Where are we now? 27 people, 28 people. We can do better than this. I'll give you another 30 seconds to look at this, and then we need to move on. Right, see if we can hit 60, then we'll move on from there. There we go. Very swiftly towards 60, 55. Oh, come on, what happened? Somebody changed their mind. We went backwards. All right, I think let's move on from here. I was hoping that we would hit 60. We're almost there, 58, 59, 60. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. All right, let's have a look at what we've got here. So the bulk of us got the answer, gave us the answer A, fair value through profit or loss, fair value through other comprehensive income and amortized cost, which is, okay, maybe I better lock this thing because we seem to be changing our minds, some of us. Okay, so 51% of us said that answer is A, which is the correct answer. Folks, under IFRS 9, we only have 3 categories of financial assets: fair value through profit or loss, fair value through OCI, and amortized cost, and that's it. Under IAS 39, we had 4 categories, and there it was very confusing, and I think that's what might have caught some of you out, because under IFRS 9, essentially what the answer is, answer C is the answer that we had under IFRS 9. We had items that were measured at fair value through profit or loss. We had items that were classified as available for sale. Not that we all understood what that meant. And that was one of the reasons why I think IFRS 9 was absolutely necessary in order to get rid of that annoyance of those words, held to maturity financial instruments and loans and receivables. That's so IFRS 9 says it was just the 3 categories, and that's it. That's all we need to remember. And the way that we measure these instruments that we now have is based on exactly what the wording, the description of the category is as well. So if you decide that you want to carry something at fair value through profit or loss, then the measurement is at fair value with the gains or losses going through profit or loss, initially and subsequently. Initially, all measurement of all financial instruments, that's a rule, is always going to be at fair value. Subsequent measurement will then be what the name describes. So if I've chosen fair value through profit or loss, then I take the gains or losses through income statement. If I've chosen fair value through other comprehensive income, then I gains or losses through other comprehensive income. If I've decided to go amortized cost, then I use the effective interest rate method to record that particular asset in my books. So folks, hopefully that makes our lives that much easier in terms of how we then record these instruments in our books, because how we name them is exactly how we account for them, you know, in our books. Now, the one thing that I just like to point out while we're here, as you put in the accounting policies together related to these financial instruments in your books, please don't go and copy the next guy and think, well, because they've spent time and effort crafting their accounting policy, so therefore they've got it right. You might be a simple organization or have simple financial instruments in your books, and you don't have day one gains and losses, you don't have any derivative instruments, you don't have any of these fancy things. So if you don't have all those things, why are you talking about them in your accounting policies? Rather describe your accounting policies from your perspective. What is it that we do as an organization? That's what we should be reflecting in our financial statements. No more than that. Because the minute we go and start talking about other things, all you're going to do is confuse the users of your financial statements. You're not going to understand what you're saying. They're not going to understand what you're saying either. So if you're uncomfortable about what you're saying, you can imagine the person on the other side who's looking at this. They will struggle to understand exactly what it is what exactly it is that you mean. Now, folks, I'd just like to have a look at these results that we got here from our from this poll that we've just done. This answer B, fair value through profit or loss, fair value through OCI, available for sale and amortized cost. I put it available for sale there, just as a red herring, to sort of point us in the wrong direction. Everything else is correct except for that available for sale. Folks, just remember just the 3 categories, no more than that we currently have under IFRS 9. When we go to financial liabilities, pretty straightforward. Just 2 categories of financial liabilities: fair value through P&L and amortized cost, and that's it. No more than that. Now, if I go back to assets for a moment, if I choose to carry something at fair value through P&L, or I choose to carry something at fair value through OCI, which could fit somewhere else, then the standard says to me, well, you're making an irrevocable choice. That means that I cannot change my mind. Once I put something into that particular category, doesn't matter what changes. I know IFRS 9 has got does provide us with an ability. If you say, for instance, if you've got a receivable that is classified at amortized cost, if your business model changes, the standard says to us, if your business model changes, well, then go back and change your accounting for your particular financial instrument. But in this scenario, because you have chosen right up front that this is what you want to do, you're making that irrevocable choice. So therefore, you can never change your mind, even if your circumstances change. So you'd have to de-recognize the asset and re-recognize something completely different for you to be able to change your accounting. But you can't go back and change the accounting on something that has already happened, something that has already passed. So just be aware of that. So folks, that's where we are. Just a bit of a recap on what is sitting in IFRS 9 and the categories of financial assets and financial liabilities. So IFRS 9 hopefully makes our lives a little bit easier because it does ask us those questions. What is it that you do? If you're in the business of selling widgets and your expectation is you will collect whatever is due to you from your customers as and when those payments are due, then that's an amortized cost instrument. I wouldn't put it anywhere else, but I can choose to carry it at fair value through profit or loss, or fair value through other comprehensive income if I choose to. But if I do make that choice, remember it's an irrevocable choice that I've made. Now, that's the recognition and measurement of both financial assets and financial liabilities. If I go to the next step, and for me, my next step is how do I deal with my impairments related to these financial instruments? IFRS 9 takes a very different stance to what we had under IAS 39. IAS 39 took the view, and if I took you back 10, 12 years ago, when the credit crisis hit us initially, this is back in 2008. So let's go back to 2008. Credit crisis has hit us. So as an organization, we have lent money to our customers. At that point in time, we then had people coming to us and saying to us, well, look, we think that we may have a problem. We may not be able to pay you on time. Would we at that point in time have been in a position to say, well, we are now going to make a provision against these debtors because they're telling us that they're not able to collect money from their own customers. They've got customers that are in Greece, that are in Spain, and those two jurisdictions have been badly hit by the credit crisis. Their banks are locking up, and therefore there's no money flowing anyway. So because of that, my customer who's done a big export order to a Spanish customer, they're not now able to recover their money from the Spanish customer. So therefore, because they're not able to collect that money from their customer, they're not able to pay me, Bank X, who has lent them money. So what do I do? Could I at that point in time have started making a provision against that particular customer? And the answer to that question is a simple no, I would not. IAS 39 would have said to me, wait until the loss event happens. I would not be in a position to say, well, it's likely to happen because I can see the writing is on the wall and there are things that are coming my way. There's a storm that is heading my way that is telling me that there's going to be an issue. So because I could not do that under IAS 39, we basically would have waited until the loss event happened. IFRS 9, on the other hand, takes a different stance and says, well, if you can see the storms ahead, well, then we should be doing something about it. We should be making a provision. If anything, IFRS 9 maybe goes to the extreme end and says, well, the minute you lend money to somebody, the minute you've lent money to Raymond, there's already a possibility that Raymond is not going to be in a position to pay you back. So if that is the case, because that is the case, we should be making a provision in our books immediately. So folks, I'd like you to have a look at this next, and I might have given you some of the answers already. Again, if you can scan the QR code there, this is a pretty straightforward one, true or false answer here. A financial asset should only be assessed for impairment when there is an indication of impairment. True or false? You can't get this one wrong. I've just given you the answer. Right. I like the responses here. We're going to break records. All right, another 10 seconds, then we need to move on. Right, we're hit 140, now I'll close it off. Thank you very much. Okay, maybe we can get to 150. Almost there. There we go. Right. Ooh, what did my answers do here? Okay, there we go. A financial asset should only be assessed for impairment when there's an indication of impairment. Folks, I guess what you are probably, those of you who have given me a false answer are probably piggybacking off what we have in IAS 36. And IAS 36 says to us, is there an only make an impairment assessment if there is an indication of impairment. IFRS 9 takes a different stance. And IFRS 9 says to us, well, the minute you lend money, so if you're lending money to me, the fact that you've now lent me money creates the possibility that there may be an impairment that will come your way. So you need to already be, right from day one, from the point at which you lend me that money, be assessing, well, is there a possibility that this person we've lent money to will not be in a position to pay us? So yes, you might look at it and say, well, they're good for it, or we have collateral, or there's not the likelihood that we are going to lose any money is next to zero. That's okay, but we need to make that assessment right from the onset. And we need to be making a provision for both. We need to be assessing the probability of both possibility that we may lose money and the possibility that we'll actually recover all our money. That's what we should be doing right from the onset. So I would go with a true answer here. We should be assessing for, we should be assessing, a financial asset should only be assessed for impairment when there is indication of impairment. I think the words in there probably what's throwing us off there. We assess for impairment even when there is no indication of impairment in terms of what we have in IFRS 9. So I guess maybe I'll give people the benefit of the doubt there, because I think the words there are probably just, the language that we used in there is probably just off. But ultimately, we're saying right from the onset, we should be making a provision for impairment right from the onset of having issued that financial instrument. Right. So I'm just going to close that off. All right. So when we look at what we have in IFRS 9 and we compare that with what is sitting in IAS 39, IAS 39 had what we call the incurred loss model, where it said, is there objective evidence that exists that there's been a loss event? And will that loss event have a detrimental impact on your future cash flows? If your answer to both those questions is a yes, then now you've triggered a credit loss. You now need to make a provision against that particular receivable, that particular debtor. Now, the problem with this is that if I take you back to 2008, 2009, with my Spanish customer who has now informed me that they cannot pay, or who's informed you that they cannot pay you, and has informed me that they cannot pay me, and I now informed you as my banker to say, well, I have a customer who owes me a significant amount of money, they cannot pay me, and because they cannot pay me, I can't pay you. Now, all of a sudden, both of us are now raising provisions for doubtful debts too late in the process, because the loss event, for all intents and purposes, has already happened. So this is why IFRS was then thought about, and the standard setters basically said, look, we need to go back and have a look at what we have in the standards, because what we currently have is not working. So in issuing IFRS 9, they're basically saying, look, we are now going to put together what we call a forward-looking model. And what this forward-looking model does is that it says a credit loss is recognized in the books immediately, as soon as the entity creates this instrument, buys a loan instrument, if there's a loan, whether it's a loan receivable, whatever it is, the minute that instrument exists, we should already be assessing for, well, is there a potential here that there may be a loss to be suffered? So therefore, we recognize that from day one. So what are these losses that we're talking about? The standard talks about credit losses, and it talks about expected credit losses. And in bringing these two things to the fore, credit losses are then defined in the standard as the present value of all cash shortfalls. So you've lent me money. You've lent me 10 million real, and you said to me, look, go away and spend, use this money however you see necessary, and I need to pay you back at some point. But I know I owe you 10 million. In your books, the contracts and everything that you and I have got say I owe you 10 million. But in the event that I may not be able to pay you back, or in there may be a delay in my ability to pay you back, that's going to have an impact on the present value of the cash that you are going to receive. So we're saying, well, we know, yes, you've lent me 10 million, but when you present value what I'll pay you back, because I'll only be able to pay you back next year or maybe the year after. Yes, you'll get all your money back in full, but time value of money may have an impact on whatever you get back. There's also a possibility that even if you may get all your money back, or there's a possibility, so that scenario I was giving is a situation where you're getting all your money back, but there's a delay in the repayment. But there also may be a possibility that I may not be in a position to pay you back all of it. I may only be able to pay you some of it. So maybe I'm able to pay you back 9 million, but even then, when I give you the 9 million, it'll also be a year from today. So now there's two things that go in. There's time value of money, and there's actually a real loss as well in the fact that you're not getting all the money that you lent to me in the first instance. So all those things would have an impact on your computation of the present value of the cash that you're going to receive. And to the extent that there's going to be a shortfall, then we need to make a provision for whatever that shortfall is going to be. So the standard then uses language in there that I guess for a lot of us would be things that we're not familiar with. So for the bankers, fine, you guys, you will probably use these terms on a regular basis. But for simple me, in a consulting business, loss given default is not language that I would use on a regular basis. But we're saying, well, all those present value of cash shortfalls is essentially the loss given default that you are going to suffer. And how we define it is that it's the difference between the contractual cash flows, so the 10 million I'm supposed to pay you, and the 9 million that you're now expecting that I'm going to pay you. That's essentially the provision that we should be creating in the books. But whatever that shortfall is, we then need to discount it using the original effective interest rate, either at the time, whatever was built into the contract that you and I entered into. So if we had agreed that the interest rate that you're going to charge me on that instrument is going to be 10%, well, then we discount it at 10%. If we haven't agreed on an interest rate, then maybe we look to see, well, this sort of borrowing, if it's an unsecured borrowing, or for a person of my sort of stature, my sort of quality, what sort of rate of interest would you normally charge? And we go with that particular rate. But we need to go and figure out, well, what rate of interest should we be looking at based on whatever is built into the contract that has been entered into. So that's basically my credit losses. Expected credit losses is a slightly different kettle of fish. Now we're building onto that initial definition of credit losses that we've just been through now. So expected credit losses are a probability weighted estimate of credit losses. So we're not saying, well, we know that we've lent our customer 10 million. They're likely to pay us back 9 million from what we can see. But what are the chances that it'll be 9 million? Maybe it's a 20% chance that they'll pay back 9 million and an 80% chance that they'll pay back all 10 million. That's what we're trying to differentiate now. Is that what is the probability of loss that we're going to suffer? So expected credit losses are a function of, and this is now going for those of you who did remember your first year accounting statistics or your advanced level back at school statistics courses in mathematics. This is what we're talking about here. Risk of default multiplied by credit losses. So risk of default is based on the probability that default is going to occur. So if we're saying the probability of default occurring is 20%, and the losses that we're likely to suffer is 1 million, well, then 20% multiplied by 1 million is what we're going to show as our expected credit loss in the books. This is what the standard then says to us, is that this is the process that we should be following in order for us to enable us to determine what that provision amount is going to look like. So in measuring our expected losses, IFRS 9 does not prescribe a particular method. Oftentimes I'll get people saying to me, but how do I go about making this provision in my books because I don't have the wherewithal, I don't have the fancy systems that the banks and insurance companies and people like that, the big corporates have got to enable me to go and make a provision in my books. So what do? Folks, does not have to, all you need to do is demonstrate that in arriving at this, I've used 20% in my example, 20% the loss that I'm anticipating, probability of loss that I'm anticipating. What is it that I've considered based on my history, based on what I'm expecting is likely to happen that would support that 20%? That's all I need to be able to demonstrate. If I wanted to further than that and develop a whole model around it, then that's fine. We can do that. Standard certainly allows for it. And it gives us a whole host of things that it says we need to take into consideration in determining what we do. But it says, ultimately, as long as the method that you're using has got 3 key building blocks in it, that's all we're looking for. Is that if you can demonstrate to us that those three key building blocks are included in what you're doing, then we'll be comfortable with the process that you're following. And the 3 key building blocks being probability weighted outcome. So here I'm taking you back to first year of accounting, statistics course, or your A levels. Probability weighted average, we're not looking here at what is the worst case scenario or what is the best case scenario. We're saying, well, given what we know about our debtors, given what we know about our debtors book and the different quality, the quality of debtors book that we have, the type of customer that we have, the risks that we're faced with, maybe we might want to segment our debtors into different categories as well while we're at it, because maybe we've got some people that are in the agricultural space, and because we've had severe monsoons this year or severe weather this year, it's going to affect their ability to pay back what they've borrowed in order to plant their fields. That may be a completely different risk category to what we might have for the manufacturing businesses, because, well, they're okay because they're exporting. And their inputs are coming from out the country, so they're not affected by what's happening in the agricultural sector directly. Yes, they may be affected in that it affects their local trade, but if they focus mainly on the export trade, they'll still be okay, even though they might face these headwinds coming out of what's happening in the economy. So I separate my debtors book into 2, agriculture and manufacturing. And then because I've got these 2 complete diverse types of debtors, I'm now going to go and assess my probability of outcome based on what is sitting in each of those 2 books. I also have a look at, I mentioned time value of money earlier on. You're lending me, your customer, 10 million today, but the possibility that I may be able to pay you back within the next 12 months it might not be possible that I'll be able to pay you back within the timeframes that have been agreed upon if it's 12 months. So if I'm going to pay you back, yes, I may be able to pay you back, but maybe I can only pay you back in 2 years' time. There's going to be a time value of money factor in there. That needs to be taken into consideration as well. So we need to discount that based on whatever the rate of interest is that has been built into our agreements. Then the third one that I've got is reasonable and supportable information. Now, folks, we're not saying go and employ an economist. I guess it's fine if you're a financial institution, you probably have economists on your payroll already. We're not saying, so if you are not in that space, we're saying whatever information you're using in order to assess potential losses, to assess the probability of potential losses, must be information that is available without undue cost or effort. So we're looking, first of all, at historic information. Folks, historic information will always form the backbone of what it is that we're going to do, the base of what it is that we're going to do. So I know, based on my customers and my history of dealing with my customers, I've been dealing with these guys for the last 10 years. I've lent them money, I've sold goods to them on credit, and within 30 days, 60 days of my issuing an invoice, I know that they always pay me. And we might get to 90 days in some instances, but that may be because maybe there was an issue around the quality of what was delivered and there was still some discussion, and maybe I had to replace the goods, and that's what got us to 90 days. So it was not through any fault of the customers, or maybe where it has been through the fault of the customers, the person who we sent the invoice to happened to go on leave at the time that we sent the invoice, and it fell through the cracks, and nobody saw that there was a invoice that was due to be paid, and therefore it wasn't paid. If that was the case, well, maybe that might indicate to us that, well, there's a potential bad debt here, but maybe it's not really a bad debt in that, because it's just an admin clerical issue that caused the issue, the problem with us not being paid on time. So because of that, we might take the view that says, well, there's no need for us to make a provision against this particular debtor. Yes, they are past due, but they're not past due in the sense that there's a problem with payment. They're past due because of the administrative error that occurred in the process. So the standard says to us, well, whatever information you're using, please just make sure that it's information that will include historic information as the base, take into consideration what is currently happening in the environment around you, and also take into consideration what you expect is likely to happen going forward. So if I took you back to my example, the 2008 example, the fact that we could see that there was potential issues happening and banks locking up, economies locking down, recession looming, all of that would have said to us, well, we should be looking to increase our provisioning, because all these signs that we are seeing are telling us that we have a potential crisis coming our way. But we've got that at the moment in South Africa, where I am, where we have been told, so going through the whole COVID crisis, what the central bank did is that they reduced interest rates, and they reduced them quite dramatically as well in that period. I think right now we are at a point where I think we are the interest rates that we are getting charged for borrowings here are at an all-time low since 1972, I think it is. So as you can imagine, in the event that interest rates start to go up, and which we're told is likely to happen, the Reserve Bank meets again, in the next 2 weeks. When they do meet, if they increase their interest rates, they increase the benchmark interest rates, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where what's been hopefully a fairly comfortable loan repayments that we've gotten used to over the last 18 months will cease to be. And when they cease to be, if I found myself in that situation where I lost my job or I had to take a pay cut during this period, and I haven't been able to get back to what my normal salary is because my employer simply couldn't afford to put me back to my normal salary, that would then mean that I'm potentially at risk. I'm potentially a risk to whoever I've borrowed money from as well, because if I need to pay a higher repayment and I cannot afford it, well, then the chances of me going into default are that much higher. So folks, it's that sort of thing that we're saying, well, take into consideration what you can see. If you can see that inflation is starting to tick up, and we can see that inflation rates around the world are starting to tick up. I think the US released their inflation numbers, was it last week sometime, and a rate of inflation of 6% in the US is unheard of. But that's where they are at the moment. So while the views have been, well, maybe it's temporary, we also need to be taking a view and say, well, if the inflation is sitting at the rate that it is sitting at, how much of that is going to impact what we are faced with if we are a net importer of goods from there? Or if we happen to find ourselves selling goods into that market, will we be able to keep up? Will the pricing of our goods allow us to still operate profitably? And if it won't, well, then we may find ourselves in a situation where the customers that we've lent money to, who are manufacturing these goods and exporting into that market, may find themselves now not able to compete. And if they're not able to compete, they're not able to sell. So if they're not able to sell, well, they can't pay us back as the bankers. Now, all of these things need to be considered as part of that forward-looking, where are things going? What does the future look like? We're not saying to you, go and buy a crystal ball and do crystal ball gazing. But we're saying, take into consideration as much information as you can that is available to you in the market. Like I said, some of the stuff that I'm talking about right now is information that you as bankers would be fully aware of. You'd be au fait with. It's things that we're seeing in the newspapers. It's things that we're seeing in the press. We're seeing if it's Reserve Banks, central banks around the world who publish, this is where things are going and this is how the economies are projected to grow. If it's the if it's the World Bank that is publishing the economic forecast, it's that sort of information that we say, well, we should be taking into consideration and then deciding how is it that we expect our businesses are going to be affected by what we're seeing in the economy at large. So folks, in looking all through this, IFRS 9 then says we have a dual measurement approach to deciding what our provisioning is going to look like. If you use what they call the general method of provisioning, then your first step is going to be to say, look, if I've got an instrument that is not potentially at risk, what are the losses that I'm expecting that I might suffer over the next 12 months? And use that as a basis for my provision. If I've got a instrument, if I've got a receivable, if I've got a debtor where I'm already experiencing some difficulties with the debtor, then I might be looking at what we call lifetime expected credit losses. But with either one of these two, they would require us to consider what is the information that is available to me in the open market that will allow me to then make those assessments of these credit losses. So if I start off by having a look at these 12-month expected credit losses, we say it's expected credit losses that result from defaults that are possible within the next 12 months. So you might look at me as Raymond and say, look, you've lent me money. And in lending me money, your assessment of my credit risk, because you'd have gone through a whole thorough process at the point at which you lent me the money, you've gone through an entire thorough process of saying, well, let's understand whether or not we should be lending money to this guy. And if you conclude that, well, yes, we think that he's okay, he's given us his pay slips, he's given us his personal balance sheet, we've done an assessment of, where he's borrowed from before, and we're happy that he's okay. We've also had a look at the various credit rating agencies and their information on him, and everything's okay. If we've been through that entire process and you're happy to lend me money, then you need to say, well, what are the chances that I may default in the next 12 months? Now, folks, choosing my words carefully there again. I may default. I'm not saying I'm actually going to default, but I may default. So you need to make that assessment of possibility of defaulting. So you're now looking at what is likely to happen in the next 12 months from this particular customer. So the standard then says probability of default. Using the probability of default amount, we need to go and work out what that probability of default is, and also have a look at our loss given default statistics. So we need to go and work out, well, of our customers that look like this guy, that look like Raymond, if we put them into a bucket, if we go back over the last however many years with the data that we have, can we extract from that information what the loss history has been in amongst those customers in that category? We might find that, well, there's been 0.5% of losses over the last 10 years that we've lent money to people that fit into this particular category. Then that's fine. Then that's what we're going to use as the basis for our provisioning. If we find that, well, we expect that the number is going to go up because, well, the last 10 years has seen fantastic economic growth, but now we're forecasting that economic growth is going to start to take a dip. Then that says to us, well, maybe we should be making a provision that is slightly different. It shouldn't be 0.5% as the statistics tell us. It should be maybe 0.75% or 1%, or maybe we need to increase that even more. And there may be some judgment call that needs to be made there, some thumb sucking that needs to be made there, but we need to have a basis for then saying, well, the 0.5% that we can see is not adequate at this point because this is the reason for it. Therefore, we need to go and do something that's different. We need to go and make a provision that is greater because that's what the information that we've got tells us. So the loss rate statistics that we've got, so if you use the probability of default approach, then we use them potential default, loss given default ratios, statistics. If you're using the loss rate approach, then the standard says, well, have a look at what history tells you and use that as a basis for then determining what your accounting is going to look like. Ultimately, your expected cash shortfalls over the next 12 months would have some impact, but what we're looking at here in our 12-month ECLs is that they don't constitute what you expect the expected cash shortfalls to be over the next 12 months. We're looking at what has actually happened in the past. what we're expecting is likely to happen going forward may come into it as well, but it's not the only thing that we're taking into consideration. In looking at our credit losses that are forecast to occur, we don't take those into consideration as well, because if we know that we have a particular customer that is already showing signs that they're not going to be able to meet the payments, well, put those aside, put them in a separate bucket because they've got a completely different risk profile to everybody else. So treat them differently. So don't go and make a provision for 1%, including the guy that you already know is giving you notice that he can't pay. That guy who is giving you notice that he can't pay, treat him differently. That loss is there for all intents and purposes. So therefore, it must be recorded very differently from everything else. Now that's different from lifetime expected credit losses. But before I go there, I just want to see if there's any questions from anybody. I don't see anything on the chat, but folks, if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to send something through on the chat, and I am going to try and keep an eye on it. Lifetime expected credit losses, saying, well, this is the sum of all expected credit losses that result from all possible default events. So I'm trying to stress the word all there, or over the expected life of the financial asset that we are dealing with. So with expected credit losses, with lifetime expected credit losses, the standard then says to us, no, it's not moving there. We might need to build a model that gives us multiple economic scenarios. So here now you're looking at calculating a weighted average of all the expected credit losses, weightings of all the probabilities of default that might exist. And here you'll find that those of us who've got the more sophisticated systems that we use, we might use, if it's a Monte Carlo simulation, a Black-Scholes model, there's be different ways that, we can approach it. But ultimately, what you're looking to do is putting together a model that allows you to calculate your expected losses, taking into consideration a whole host of different scenarios that may be possible. So under IFRS 9 then will then say to us, well, if you are going to make a provision for expected credit losses, there are three approaches if you're using the general model. The general approach, so in using this general approach, it says split your debtors book into three different categories. Those debtors that are performing, those debtors that are underperforming, and then those debtors that you know are already credit impaired, not performing, we're having to push them, we're having to hand them over to debt collectors. Those guys, we know already there's losses there. It's just an issue of how much the loss is going to be. So if we know that if that's where we are, each one of these things is going to be treated very differently. So with my performing debtors, the debtors that are doing well, there I'm saying, well, I'm only going to look over the next 12 months. What are my potential losses from these debtors over the next 12 months? That's the number that I should be using to make a provision to recognize my expected credit losses in my books. So the standard says to me, when it comes to credit risk on my performing book, you'll find that those debtors are performing, they're paying on time. So if I give people 30 days, 60 days to pay me, 30 days comes, they've already paid. We never have to follow them up. But it does not stop us from having to make a provision against those debtors all the same, because we don't know where, at what point in amongst the entire population of all those people, one of them may default, which is why we then go back into our history and say, well, of the debtors that we know are performing debtors, what does history tell us about their performance? Have we lost any money from any of them? And we may find that, yes, we have lost money from some of them over that period. So that's why we then make a provision based on what the expected potential loss is on those particular debtors, as good as they may be. Then we have the underperforming debtors. There we make a provision for what we call the lifetime losses. Now, for those of you, I guess you guys a lot of you are bankers on the call, that we would make a provision, or we would provide loans to companies, to entities, to individuals over more than a 12-month period. So where we're making provision we're providing loans over a period that is longer than 12 months, then we are looking at what are the losses that we expect to suffer over the lifetime of this instrument. So if it's a mortgage, we've given somebody a loan in order to enable them to buy a house, and they'll pay it off over the next 25 years. then what are the losses that we expect to suffer over the 25 years that this person is going to owe us an amount of money? That's the number that we're looking for. That's the number that we need to see in our books related to this particular receivable. So our credit quality may not be impaired at that point in time, but we may find that it may have deteriorated. So we therefore, if there is a movement in the credit quality from where we were under the performing to where we are in stage 2 and underperforming, then that says to us that we need to be moving our receivable from stage 1 to stage 2. We may find ourselves in stage 3. Like I said to you, stage 3 is where we're saying, well, the customer that we're looking at here, it's not moving. The customer that we're looking at here is already showing us signs that there are specific impairment issues. So therefore, we need to record that as an impairment issue in our books. We need to make a provision, again, based on lifetime expected credit losses. Having gone through that process and having assessed the risk, having determined that there's a risk of default, IFRS 9 will then say to us, in looking at this thing that we're calling a risk of default, there are 3. Default in itself is a key building block in that 3-stage general model that we're applying here. Have there been any changes in the risk of default by the customer? So like I said, is that you might have lent money to me at the beginning of this year, everything checked out, and you were happy to put me to stage 1. But from then up until now, I've now lost my job. I'm now find myself in a situation where I'm finding it difficult to repay what I owe. That in itself will then say to you that you should be changing your assessment of my risk, because risk of default has now increased substantially, specifically around me. So therefore, in assessing that credit risk that we are faced with, Standard then says, well, when is an assessment of credit risk done? It says at each reporting date, we need to go and do an assessment of credit risk. You also need to look at, has there been a change in the risk of default? And while we're there, have a look to see what impact all of this might then have on your expectation of what the credit losses might be that you're going to suffer. So every single year, we need to be going back and having a look at where are we with our customer? Is there a possibility then that there may be potential losses that are coming our way that needs to be taken into consideration in our books? So let's take a look at this example. So let's assume a debtor becomes overdue by 30 days. Standard says to us, there's a rebuttable presumption in the fact that we have a debtor who should have paid us 30 days ago, hasn't paid us, and we've been trying to get hold of them, but for whatever reason, we are struggling. So there's a rebuttable presumption that in IFRS 9 that says that debtor is potentially impaired. So they may have been in stage 1, but we need to be moving them into stage 2. But folks, the key word here for me is rebuttable presumption, because my debtor might have been in stage 1. They might have become overdue by more than 30 days, as the example says, but that does not in itself say to me that the debtor is bad. It could be that debtor that I spoke about early on, where the creditor's clerk that we sent the invoice to went on leave. And we sent that invoice literally the day that they went on leave, so they missed the email. And they've taken a month worth of leave. So when they come back, if nobody else is attending to their work in the meantime, and we don't know that they're on leave, then, well, that invoice is going to sit there for 30 days. But when they do come back, we know that this company is good for the money. We know that there might have been an administrative glitch of some sort. That's why we have not been able to get our money out of it. Well, if that's the case and we can prove that, then that's a rebuttable presumption that we've got that even though this debtor may be 30 days past due, it's okay. We'll be able to get our money back from them. So therefore, we'll account for this as if it's still in stage 1. We would not necessarily then move it into stage 2 or stage 3. So we need to understand, well, what sort of receivable are we looking at? And to to what extent might that potentially have an impact on what we're showing in our books? So just to recap on that, 3 stages: performing debtors, put everybody that's performing that you're happy with, that is sticking to the credit terms that you've given, put them into stage 1. You might want to split that stage 1 into different subcategories if maybe your customers have got different risk profiles. So like I said, agricultural customers versus manufacturing customers, they may want to treat them differently because their risk profiles are different. That's fine, we can do that. We go to stage 2, those who are underperforming, where we're saying, well, these are the guys that quality has deteriorated from when we initially created these debtors. So therefore, they're now other risk that we would not otherwise have had. So if that is the case, well, then let's put them into a different category, into stage 2. Again, I may want to split them up into different categories: my agricultural customers versus my manufacturing customers. Stage 3 is where we're saying, well, we know that there's problems. This guy, Raymond, is in that stage. We have been trying to get a hold of him, can't get hold of him. He's made promises when we have been able to speak with him. He's made promises that he's not been able to keep. So therefore, we'll put him into stage 3 because there he's definitely non-performing. We definitely credit impaired. So therefore, our level of provisioning will change depending on what each of these categories says to us. So like I said before, is that IFRS 9 does not tell us how to then go about doing it. But if we decide that this is what we're going to do, then that's fine. Happy, as long as we can support that information, we can support those expectations, those probabilities that we've determined using information that is available to us, that should be okay. There are 2 exceptions to using this general approach that I've just been describing now. And the one is what we call the simplified approach, and the other is called the credit adjusted effective interest rate approach. So if I use the simplified approach basically looks to, if I'm W Consulting, the company that I'm with, and we look at our debtors book, we might say, well, look, because we're not as complicated as you guys are, with the banks and things, all we've got is people who owe us money for the services that we provided. And it's people that we've been dealing with for over many years. So therefore, we have a sense as to will they pay, will they not pay, and so forth. So we might decide, well, let's use the simplified approach, which basically looks at a history. What does the history tell us about the losses that we suffer from our customers? And we use that as a basis for our provisioning. So we apply that to our trade receivables, to our contract assets. Here I'm talking about contract assets coming out of IFRS 15. So any assets, remember, if we haven't invoiced something under IFRS 15, doesn't mean we can't recognize the revenue. But to the extent that we haven't invoiced yet, we also required to assess those potential receivables, not going to call them potential receivables, those receivables, because they are receivables. We have done the work, we just haven't invoiced yet because maybe we haven't met a milestone. So those receivables also need to be assessed for potential impairment. If I've got lease receivables, I'm also required, this is now in terms of IFRS 16, I'm also required to go and assess those lease receivables for impairment. So somebody owes me money because they owe me rent on a building that they're using, my building that they're renting from. If they haven't paid me yet, assess that for impairment as well. Is there a potential for impairment? And then if I use the credit adjusted effective interest rate approach, the standard says to me there I'm looking at purchased or originated credit impaired financial assets. We go and buy a debtor's book from a customer. And in that debtor's book, so maybe we offer a debt factoring service. In that debtor's book, we already know that there's potential issues there. So we paid an amount of money, fair value, whatever that fair value is. We determined fair value, we paid fair value for that particular debtor's book. And in recording this debtor's book in our book, we then, subsequent to that initial recognition, we now need to go and assess, well, what are the chances that we'll be able to collect what is due to us from the customer that we've now taken on? And if there's a possibility that we won't be able to to collect all of it, then we need to write it down. We need to make a provision for expected credit losses arising out of that. And that would take into consideration, well, what is the interest rate that was effective on these instruments when we initially bought them, and use that as a basis for our provision. So in recognizing our provision in our books, Standard says to us, well, on initial recognition, when we're trying to determine what our provision or loss allowance is going to be, we are looking at 12 months expected credit losses that we're trying to determine. And look at those 12 months expected credit losses that we're trying to determine. We need to be looking at the probability of default over the next 12 months and multiplying that against the total lifetime expected credit losses that would result from default. That's the number that's a formula that's effectively we are using in calculating what our losses are likely to be. So that's on initial recognition. Subsequent years, Standard then says to us, well, whatever loss allowance we need to show in our books needs to be increased by an unwinding of the discount that relates to that particular loss. So we record an expected credit loss in the current year. There will be an unwinding of discount because another year has gone by the time it gets to next year. We also need to recognize in our income and recognize in income statement an impairment loss or gain related to any amounts of expected credit losses or reversals of those credit losses that will have occurred during that period since we last recorded this expected credit loss in our books. If the credit risk increases significantly, if it's increased significantly since initial recognition, then the standard then says, well, we may then need to move our instrument from stage 1 to stage 2, or from stage 1 to stage 3, or stage 2 to stage 3, and recognize what we call lifetime expected credit losses. Now remember, folks, if you're dealing with stage 1 instruments, we only look to what losses are we likely to suffer over the next 12 months and make a provision based on that. Look at probability of default, make a provision based on that. Where we now in stage 2 and stage 3, we're looking at lifetime expected credit losses. And you look at those lifetime expected credit losses without applying our probability of default to those lifetime losses in order to then work out what our ECL is going to be that we're going to show in our books. So lifetime expected credit losses would effectively now be your closing balance. Would then be a function of the carrying amount of your asset, the gross carrying amount of your asset, less the present value of the revised receipts that you're expecting you're expected to get from your customer. Because remember what we said earlier on when we talked about the definitions, we said, well, your credit losses are the shortfall between what you're contractually entitled to and what you expect you are going to get. So all of this is building up on that particular formula. Where there's been a significant increase in credit risk, then the standard says to us, please use all possible sources of information in assessing whether or not there's been a significant increase in credit risk. Unfortunately for us, the standard does not tell us what significant increase in credit risk actually means. So there's no wording in there that says this is the sort of scenario that you'd find yourself in. But what it does give us are indicators. And it says, look, significant increase in credit risk could arise from changes in your economic or in the market conditions. So I said to you earlier on today, I know in South Africa at the moment that we have been told that the central bank is not going to lower interest rates anymore. If anything, our inflation, because we use inflation targeting here, our inflation is now sitting towards the higher end of where it needs to be. So therefore, there's a good chance that the Reserve Bank is going to start increasing interest rates. And when they look at the economic outlook across the world, and they can see that a lot of other emerging economies whom we do business with are also seeing inflationary pressures, all of that says to them, well, the economic outlook is not looking too good. So the market conditions are not looking too good. So all of that would then say to you, if I'm owed money by somebody who's going to be affected by this directly, well, am I not going to have a problem in collecting what is due to me? So those changes in the economic conditions would then indicate to us that, well, we have a potential issue coming our way. Have there been significant changes in the operating results or the financial position of the borrower? When they gave us their set of financial statements last year to have a look at, to do the assessment of whether or not we're going to lend them money, They were doing fantastically. Now, all of a sudden, well, what was a very profitable business seems to be reducing in its profitability. Again, that would indicate to us that we have a potential problem. Maybe their credit rating has been amended. There's been a downgrade. There's been changes in financial support. Maybe they had a parent company who was happy to give them guarantees. The parent company is now withdrawing the guarantee or declines to renew a guarantee that we requested as a bank. All those things would be indications that there's a potential issue here. There may be a potential breach of covenants, potential breach of loan terms, or there maybe we're expecting a delay on payments. All those things will be indications to us that we might have a potential increase in the credit risk that we're faced with this particular customer. So if that's where we are, then the standard then says, well, go and increase your provisioning against that customer. But nothing stops us going the other way as well. Is that we might have a customer that we've put into stage 2 or stage 3 because of an event that occurred. But now they're back on track again. So the standard says to us, well, lifetime expected credit losses can revert to 12-month expected credit losses if credit risk subsequently improves and the requirement for lifetime ECLs is no longer met. If we can see from our customer that they're doing better, and they're performing better than they were before, and they're paying on time, and the information that we're seeing, the economic outlook is telling us that things are looking rosy, all that would indicate to us that, well, we should be reassessing the quality of our customer. So in reassessing the quality of our customer, we can see based on what we've got out there that they'll be okay to meet their requirements. So if that's the case, go back to where we were before. We spoke about this rebuttable presumption. There's an expectation that you are faced with losses if your payments that are due to you are more than 30 days past due. But if you can demonstrate to us that it's something that you've been able to get over, it's something that you've been able to resolve with the customer, then the standard says, well, no problem, put you back into where we used to be. No need for us to show that as a stage 2 or stage 3 receivable. Folks, are there any questions from anybody? I don't see anything on the chat. But if there are, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Right. Sometimes when it comes to our provisioning, going through this general model may not be necessary because maybe we are in an environment where we're exposed to low credit risk because our customers are such that maybe a lot of them pay cash, or we have customers where we do sell on credit. The level of sales that we have on credit are so small that the level of risk that we are exposed to is not significant. So the standard says, well, we're going to give you what we call a practical expedient related to low credit. And this says you can choose to use this practical expedient and basically only provide for expected credit losses in the next 12 months if you meet the criteria. But for you to be able to meet the criteria, you need to be able to demonstrate to us that whatever credit risk you're exposed to, or whatever changes there are to the credit risk that you're exposed to, is relatively small. And the amount of risk that you're exposed to itself is also small. Now, the issue is, like I said, is that when is credit risk considered to be low? The standard doesn't really define it for us. But I guess the criteria that one would look to when trying to determine whether or not credit is low is the risk instrument that I've issued as the lender. The risk of default in that instrument is low all on its own. The borrower, the person that I'm dealing with, my counterparty, has a strong capacity to meet their financial commitments. Maybe they have the backing of a parent, and in the event that I can't get joy from the subsidiary company whom I'm dealing with directly, I simply go to the parent. We have a long-standing relationship, and I can point out to them that there's an issue here, and they're happy to make sure that I get paid. Or if I find myself in a situation where there may be adverse long-term changes to the economic environment, or the business conditions in which we're operating in. But we know that given the track record of this company that we're dealing with, it's unlikely that that will phase them. They'll be okay. They've weathered bigger storms than this before, and they're likely to be able to be okay to see this one through as well, to see this one through as well. So if that's the case, and we've made this assessment, then yes, we are allowed to make an exception to this. And we simply will look to say, well, we are now going to assess what are the chances of us making losses from our receivables over the next 12 months, and that's it. We don't do anything further than that. So there's no need for us to go the whole hog as we did before with when I gave you that general model and putting things into 3 different buckets: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. No need for that. We simply work on the basis of what our history tells us about our receivables, and that will then inform us as to what our provision amount is likely to look like. Okay, just give me a moment, folks. I'm just trying to see if I can. Okay. So I just trying to keep an eye on the chat. Something seemed to have moved, and so I thought maybe there might be a question. Standard also says to us, when it comes to credit ratings, if your credit rating has changed, then that indicates to us that there's been a change in your risk profile. So if you find that you're dealing with somebody whose credit risk rating is at least a BBB on the S&P standard of measure, then that's an investment grade instrument that you've got there. So if you've got that, then no problem. There's no need for you to go and make a provision the way that we've been describing it. But the minute you have somebody whose investment grade is lower than that BBB, then we are basically now going into non-investment grade, into junk status bond grade ratings. And in that space, we now need to make a concerted effort to ensure that we are assessing those particular receivables for impairment to see whether or not there is anything else that might need to be considered here. BBB would indicate to us that there's an adequate capacity by that particular receivable, by that particular debtor, to pay us what is due to us. But the minute we go any lower than that, then that says to us that we might have an issue. You might not be using an S&P measure. You might have your own internal measure for your customers. And then maybe your international customers, those are the ones that you would rate on an S&P or a Moody's rating or Moody's rating scale or something like that. That's okay. But whatever your measure of your rating scale is, we want you to use that and assess, well, has there been a movement from when we initially recorded this receivable in our books to where we are now? If there has been a change, then that would say to us that, well, we need to make sure that we then change the way that we then approach the provisioning against that particular receivable, because the indications are there that the level of risk that we are looking at is very different from when we initially started. So if there's been a deterioration, then we need to make sure we're making a provision. We're increasing our provision. So one of the things that IFRS 9 tells us is that as we go along in making our provisions for expected credit losses, we need to take into consideration the latest information that we've got available to us, because that will then ultimately have an impact on the level of provision that we're going to show in the books and whether or not we're going to be adequately provided for in the event that these losses then manifest, losses actually occur. So what I'd like to do for a moment is if we're going to have a look at debt instruments as financial assets and what IFRS 9 would then say to us on that. So IFRS 9 says to us, if you've got financial assets that are debt instruments and are measured at amortized cost or are measured at fair value through other comprehensive income, then you need to make a provision for them in accordance with what we have, the guidance that we're now going to talk through now. This guidance here will not be applicable to any financial assets that are debt instruments, but we've chosen to measure them at fair value through profit or loss. Remember what I said right at the beginning? And I said to you, you may have made that irrevocable designation to carry a particular financial asset at fair value through profit or loss. Well, if you've done that, that one's excluded because we're measuring it at fair value and taken the gains or losses through income statement anyway. But where we're dealing with the fair value through other comprehensive income financial instrument, there may be an impairment issue related to that asset, which needs to be recorded. And there also will be an element of fair value adjustments, which needs to be recorded against that same asset. So that's why that one is treated slightly different. If I'm looking at investments and equity instruments that are also measured at fair value, because I'm taking those gains or losses through profit or loss or through other comprehensive income, there's no need for me to be applying the impairment model that we've got in IFRS 9 to those sorts of instruments. They are already at fair value. So in looking at these instruments, IFRS 9 then says to me, any financial assets that are measured at amortized cost would then need to look at all the various stages of the credit losses that we've got and record any movements that are necessary, any credit losses that are necessary, record them in profit or loss. And if you find that, so record any movements in your ECL in profit or loss, in the profit or loss section of your statement of profit or loss and other comprehensive income. And then on your balance sheet, on your statement of financial position, you either offset the carrying amount of that, or the amount of that expected credit loss against the carrying amount of the receivable, or you show a separate loss allowance. It's up to you. If you show it net on the face of your statement of financial position, then in the notes, we need to see the gross amounts and what the provision amount is. For debt instruments that are measured at fair value through other comprehensive income, any fall in fair value related to credit losses, that needs to be recorded in profit or loss. Anything else that has affected the carrying value of this debt instrument that is measured at fair value through OCI will then be recorded in other comprehensive income. Here, there is no offsetting in your statement of financial position because the instrument is already measured at fair value. But we need to explain to us in your notes that you've got an amount of expected credit losses that has been recorded in the books related to this instrument that is measured at fair value through other comprehensive income. So that might still come through in the disclosures that you provide us with, so we have an understanding of what it is that we're looking at and why we're looking at the numbers in that particular fashion. All right. Having said that, I'd like to give you an opportunity to exercise your mind a little bit. I've not set this up as a poll, but I'd like for you to be able to, you've got a piece of paper next to you, to work your way through this case study, write down an answer. And once you've got an answer, I'd like for you to, this is an honesty jar system that we're using here, to compare what your answer is with the answer that I will ultimately then put up on the screen. So if you're told here, Alex Limited gave a 2-year loan that is measured at amortized cost, 2-year $20 million loan to Bold Limited on 1 February. 12-month expected credit losses were 1 million and these were charged to admin expenses. The coupon and the effective rate were both 8% on the loan. Interest was received on 31 January 26 and recorded correctly, despite a significant deterioration in the economic conditions within the industry that Bold Limited operates. Hence, the investment is to be downgraded with an expected 40% chance of default on the remaining cash flows. No entry has yet been made to downgrade the investment in the financial statements. So what's required here is how would Alex deal with this in its books of account for the year ended 31 January of the following year. So this is a year later. How would we deal with this? I'm just going to give you a minute or so to just think about that. And then I'm going to put up an answer. But like I said, it's an honesty jar system. I expect that you would have, whatever you've jotted down, I'd like you to compare my answer with what you've got. And then we can see where the learnings may be. All right, 15 seconds. Right, I'm going to take the question off now. Let's give you my answer. So we're told here, the financial asset has only 1 year still left to run by the time we're doing this reporting, because we are reporting here at 31 January 2026. So therefore, if it is a 2-year loan that was initially given, $20 million, and we told at that point in time, everything about this instrument said, everything's hunky-dory. If we lose anything, it's likely that we'll lose $1 million, and that will be it. So that's what would have had to be recorded on day one of entering into this arrangement. The fact that things have deteriorated since then would then say to us that there's a need to go and increase that provision. And we're told there is now a 40% chance of default on the remaining cash flows. So if there's a 40% chance of default on the remaining cash flows, interest has been paid. The interest that was due to be paid has been paid, but there's the principal amount that remains and whatever additional interest that still remains. That's what we need to be focusing on. So in focusing on those things, Standard then says as well, contractual cash flows that are due in the next 12 months from 31 January 2026 is going to be 21.6 million, because 20 million capital plus interest for that year at 8%, which is 1.6 million. And because we were in stage 1 and moving on to stage 2, we're now saying, well, over the lifetime of this instrument, whatever is left of the lifetime of this instrument, we're now expecting that we're now expecting that we are going to lose 40% of whatever is outstanding. So if we're expecting we're going to lose 40%, it then means, sorry, what is the number that we've got there? Did I have 40% chance of default? Yes, 40% chance of default. So therefore, if we expect that there's a 40% chance of default, then the standard then says to us, how we then calculate that is we take our carrying amount of our instrument less the present value of any expected cash flows. And in this case, we know 20 million is our principal, and 12 million, 60% of 21.6 million present value. So we know that the discount rate is 8%. So that's why we get 8% over here. I'm on the wrong place there. 8% over there as a denominator in this calculation to give us. And the number that we then get coming out of that will then be 8 million. So effectively, we're expecting that we are going to lose 8 million. So we've gone with 60% here because 60% is what we're expecting we are going to get back. 40% is what we're likely to lose. So therefore, we're saying, well, if we're likely to lose 8 million in total on this instrument, then we've already provided last year for 1 million. So therefore, we need to increase that provisioning by 7 million to get to 8. So therefore, a further impairment of 7 million must be recorded in the books and recorded against our profit or loss. So total impairment that would then show, total expected credit losses would then show against this particular receivable will then be in total $8 million. So folks, we're working on the basis of the information that we have available to us, and in calculating these, in this case with the 40% that we have that inform the 60 that we've got over there, it will be based on what our history is telling us and what our expectations are going forward, what we know about this organization. Okay. I'm hoping that we're all okay on that and we've been able to get that particular answer right. If we're all okay on that, then let me work out, let's go through another example. I'd like to see what that example says to us. So you've got a company here, eBay. On 31 May, eBay made a loan, 20x5, eBay made a loan of $100 million to a customer at an interest rate of 4.5% per annum. On 31 May 25, the expected credit losses that would result from default at a discount rate of 4% was 25 million. The potential default, probability of default over the next 12 months was 10%, and the 12-month expected credit losses had been recognized. By 31 May of the following year, the customer was in serious financial difficulties, and there was objective evidence of impairment. The present value of the ECLs was revised to 48.1 million. no entries have been made for the year ended 31 May 26. So what's required here is for us to have a look at the accounting implications for that year ended 31 May 26. So again, taking into consideration what we've just learned from the previous example, how would you apply it in this scenario that we've now got? Have a look at that. I'll give you a minute or so to work through it. Okay, 15 seconds. Right, how would we deal with this? 31 May, we were already told allowance recognized would be based on 12 months ECL. At that point in time, we were told 10% if there was going to be a loss, the loss would be 25 million, but there's a 10% chance of that loss occurring. So therefore, we apply probability of default multiplied by the loss that we're looking at, the lifetime expected credit loss, to give us the amount that we would then show in that particular period. So we'd record 2.5 million in the books at that point. So therefore, when you go to the following year, the 2.5 million is what would then be brought forward. In the following financial year, 31 May 20x6, in that year, we then say, well, the allowance brought forward would be that 2.5 million. But remember, we have the unwinding of the discount. That provision was made last year. So we have an unwinding of a discount that is occurring in the current financial reporting period that must be taken into consideration. So, and we're told the discount rate is 4%. So 4% of 2.5 million gives us 100,000 that we've got over there. So we're now going to debit P&L by 100,000, credit our loss allowance, increase our loss allowance by another 100,000. Now we've got a loss allowance of 2.6 million. Now we go to what has happened in the current year. We've reached stage 3 with this instrument because the customer is not able to pay us back on time. We know that. So therefore, we now need to make a provision for an additional amount. And we're told the loss is now increased to 48.1 million. We know that that's what the actual loss is going to be. We've got a provision of 2.6 million, and we're told, well, we need to increase this to 48.1 million. That means that year, we're going to debit our P&L 45.5 million and credit our loss allowance account by 45.5 million, increasing that provision to 48.1 million. So folks, information is there. There may be some of it that would require us to go and apply some sort of judgment in order to be able to get the right answer, to be able to get if it's a probability, for instance. But do we have enough information available to us to enable us to make those calls? To the extent that we do, then use that as a basis for our provisioning. Excuse me. Sorry. All right, folks, I don't see any questions from anybody at this point in time. I assume that everything's okay. So if we're all okay, then I think let's carry on from where we are. All right. So folks, it is coming up to 1:30 at the moment. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to ask, can we take a comfort break? Let's do a 10 minutes. So let's come back in at 20 minutes to the hour. Then we'll carry on with another case study before we carry on with a little bit more of the theory of what is sitting in IFRS 3. So 20 minutes, so about 11 minutes sort of worth of a break. We'll come back in at 20 minutes to the hour. Thank you very much. Right, welcome back, everybody. I think let's get started. I'm just going to share my screen. Right. Excuse me. Right, so I don't see any questions from anybody coming through on the chat, but if you do have any questions, please do feel free to comment. Samnang, thank you very much for your comment, and yeah, let's carry on. Next case study that I've got is this one on Newton. If you have a look at what I've got on Newton, on 1 January 20x5, Newton acquires a debt instrument with a fair value of 12,000 and is measured at fair value through other comprehensive income. So that's this curveball that I talked about earlier on, where we've got elements of ECL and fair value going into the same instrument. The instrument is the rate of interest rate. Interest rate is 5%, which is the same as the effective rate over the contractual term of 5 years. At 30 June 20x5, which is the reporting date, its fair value was 10,500. Newton determines that there is no significant increase in credit risk since initial recognition, and that 12 months ECLs should be $350. Newton decides to sell the instrument at fair value on 1 July 20x6 for 10,500. We're told here to ignore any entries related to interest. What's required here is to show us what the interest would be at 1 January 20x5, 30 June 20x5, and then 1 July 20x6 related to this instrument that we are looking at. So again, just I'll give you about a minute to think through that and see what it is that we should be doing on this. Maybe I'll give it a little bit longer. I'll give you about 2 minutes to work your way through this. Just think through those journeys. 1 minute. Okay, let's work our way through this. So we've got all this information about what we should be recording. So at initial recognition, we need to record the financial instrument itself, this debt that's been created. So at that date, debiting financial asset, the fair value through OCI, 12,000, crediting the bank, 12,000. At June of that same year, when we're now reporting in terms of what has happened, we told, well, ECLs on that instrument are expected in that year to be 350. So therefore, we need to take that against our profit or loss. So debit P&L, 350. There's been a movement in the value of this instrument that's dropped that value of that instrument from where it initially was of 12,000 to 10,500. But we told, well, the rest of it, the rest of the movement in the value is not ECL related. It's everything else. Maybe interest rates have changed, or something has happened in the market, which has led to the fair value of this instrument dropping the way that it has. So therefore, the 150, the differential between the 350 and the 1500, we take that to other comprehensive income. And then we talk about that as being, those being the adjustments that we're going to record on this instrument in this period related to the movements in its fair value. So that's a 30 June 20X5. If we go to the following year, because the following year we're told Newton decides to sell the instrument at fair value at 1 July 20X6 for 10,500. So at that point, the bank is going to go up by 10,500. Financial assets will come down by 10,500. And then whatever amount that we taken to OCI at that point in time will now need to be recycled. So we taken 150 into OCI before in the previous entry, and assuming that nothing else changes about the fair value of this instrument in between that date and the next reporting date, no other movements that need to go through to ECL and that sort of thing, then it's simply a recycling of the losses that were taken to OCI last year, which are now going to be recorded in income statement. So we debit P&L 150, we credit other comprehensive income 150, and that's it. Pretty straightforward, pretty clear in terms of what the entries should be and what the thinking is behind each one of them. But on this example, I just wanted to highlight to you that the entries that we show are going to be split between a portion of it, because it's a fair value through other comprehensive income instrument, a portion of the movements in the value is going to be attributed to impairment losses, and another portion is going to be attributed to other comprehensive income. And we need to record it as such in the period in which it happens. And then also bear in mind that there is going to be a recycling that will need to happen and in later years when that instrument is eventually then realized. So don't forget this last entry over here. Right. Let's have a look at another case study. So this one is on Big Bang. Big Bang says, on Big Bang we're told on 1 July 20X8, Big Bang provided a 3-year interest rate loan of 3 million to Jupiter. Big Bang estimated the risks of default and loss given default rates at 1 July and 31 December 20X8 and 20X9 as follows. So we're given all that information in the table. What's required of us here is to determine the loss allowance that Big Bang should create at 1 July 28, 31 December 28, and 31 December 29. Now, I'd like us to just work our way through this. Maybe let's work our way through this together. So we make sure that we're clear about what it is that we're looking at. So bear in mind what we've got on here. We told risk of default in the next 12 months at each of those dates, risk of default in the next 13 to 36 months for each of these. We also told what the loss given default rates are. And then we've got a calculation that's already been done for us there, where we're taking the loss given defaults and multiplying by the amount of the loan that's been applied, that's been given to give us the potential loss. And then the last column that we've got there is in giving us what the lifetime expected credit losses are going to be for each one of these instruments. So, and basically you'll see on there is that last column is a function of risk of default X, risk of default Y. Now, depending on whether we look at 12 months or we look at lifetime, we might need to add the two together, multiplied by the amount of the loan, the amount of the potential loss that we're likely to suffer on the loan. So if I go to 1 July 20x8, I'm told there, on initial recognition, Big Bang needs to recognize a loss allowance that is equivalent to 12 months worth of ECLs. There's nothing at that point in time that says to Big Bang that there's potential losses that are going to extend beyond 12 months, that are going to extend beyond what you initially expecting, because this instrument is, if anything, is in stage one. So if it's in stage one, we only look to what are the potential losses in the next 12 months. And we are told here in the table, potential losses in the next 12 months at 1 July 20x8, we'd estimate it at 3%. So therefore, we're estimating losses at 3% in the next 12 months. Then we're going to take that 3% multiplied by the losses that we anticipate of 1.2 million. Again, we're given that number in this table. In the next three, we're expecting losses to be, the loss given default is 40%, and then the actual loan is 3 million. So if we suffer any losses, the losses will be 40% multiplied by 3 million, which is 1.2 million. So we're given all those numbers. So we're now looking at 3% multiplied by 1.2 million to give us 36,000. So the only provision we make in that year will be 36,000. However, if things change, and we told you that things have changed, at 31 December 20x8, Big Bang would need to go back and evaluate if the credit risk has increased significantly since initial recognition. Remember what I said to you earlier on. At each reporting date, we go back and we assess, where was our customer? Were they in stage one? Or where are they now? Do they remain in stage one? If there's any indication that there's a deterioration in their credit risk, we may need to put them into stage 2 or stage 3. So we go and we do that. Standard says, go back, reevaluate if the practical expedient for low credit risk has been adopted. And we can do that because we've got a customer here whom we know is good for the money. They're supported by a parent. They're low credit risk to us. They've got the capacity to pay. If we've chosen to go that particular route, no problem. And the standard then says, well, have a look to see if you've decided to go this low credit risk expedient route, ask these questions. What is the credit risk relative to what is the credit risk now relative to what it was at initial recognition? Is the total risk of default? If it's changed, well, can we understand that? In this scenario, we're told total risk of default has increased from 8% to 15%. That in itself looks like it's a significant number. So that would then say to us, well, maybe we should not be using this expedient. Ask the next question. Is the absolute level of credit risk still assigned as low? And in this scenario, so well, despite the fact that low is not quantified, the fact that we've got a 15% risk of default seems to indicate that the risk of loss is high. So therefore, we need to make a provision for lifetime expected credit losses. We've got to change the classification of this instrument from stage 1 to stage 2 or stage 3, because everything about this instrument is saying to us that there is a potential, there's much higher risk than when we initially started. So therefore, if we're doing that, therefore, we'll then need to go back and have a look to see what are the losses that we would suffer at using the lifetime expected credit losses. Again, going back to our table here, we've already done the calculation. We'll be looking at lifetime expected credit losses. So we're adding 4%, the 4% that we've got here. So this is 31 December, 4% plus 11% gives us 15%. 15% multiplied by the 1050 gives us what we've got here as the 152,250. So folks, we've got the information. It's just a matter of how we're using this information. If we go to the next reporting date, again, we have information in the table. Big Bang evaluates whether the credit risk since 1 July 20x8 has changed. And if it's decided, well, actually, you know what? Credit risk has now decreased, and we're told that it has, and it's lower than risk at initial recognition. That means, well, maybe we should be going back to where we started. Again, ask the question, is the absolute level of credit risk low? Again, in this scenario, we find that, well, it's not relevant as there's no significant increase in credit risk in comparison with what was initially recognized. So therefore, we don't have very much credit risk, in which case they can revert to the 12-month expected credit losses that would have recognized previously. So again, going back to the information that we have on the chart, risk of default in the next 12 months is 2%. And if that default occurs, what is the likely loss? We're told the likely loss is 750,000. So then apply the 2% to the 750,000, and you'll see on here, that's what they've done. And there's a provision that will then be recorded in the books based on of 15,000. And that's it. So whatever was recorded before would then have to be revised, would then have to be reversed. But we're not going back and we're having a look at this on a regular basis. So at each reporting date, you're having a look at it to see, well, where are the changes and what are these changes doing to the numbers that we're showing in the books? Will there be an impact on the numbers that we ultimately show in our books? And if there is going to be an example, it's going to be an amount that will change there, then that will then need to be amended. Right. See, there's a question that has come up. Let's see if I can read it. In the eBay example, the allowance grows according to the unwinding of the discount because the loan is repaid with a bullet repayment. In the case of a loan paid on a monthly basis, the 12-month ECL would become smaller with the carrying amount of the loan. In that case, can we assume we do the opposite entries? Debit allowance, credit P&L. Absolutely, Casey. We would do that because our provision, because we're essentially looking at what is it that we are owed at each reporting date. We'd have made a provision at initial recognition that would have been based on a much bigger outstanding principal amount. And whatever we expect the future cash flows are going to be related to interest and so forth. Now that some payments have already been made, our provisioning is now going to be based on whatever the balance remaining is at the next reporting date. So yes, to the extent that there's repayments that are happening and so forth, that would then say to us, well, we can now reduce our provisioning, no problem. We can reduce the provisioning, and how we then record that in the books would then be, we'd be debiting the provision, we'd be debiting the ECL provision, crediting our income statement. So essentially reducing it. Same place where we took the initial entry to record the ECL amount is where we take the reverse. Okay. Then what happens if you are W consulting? Simple receivables, nothing complicated about the business. What's available in terms of the approach to providing for expected credit losses. So IFRS 9 provides us with what they call the simplified approach, and this will then be the alternative to the general approach of providing for provisions for expected credit losses. And in using this expected credit losses model, the simplified approach to expected credit losses provisioning, the standard says, look, if you are dealing with trade receivables or contract assets, remember contract assets are those that are coming out of IFRS 9, out of IFRS 15, the revenue recognition standard. And those trade receivables or contract assets are likely to be collected within a year or less, or they don't have a significant financing component to them. Then the standard says, well, you can recognize a loss allowance at initial recognition based on what your likely losses are going to be over the lifetime of these instruments. So if your history tells you that, well, whenever I sell goods on credit, my last 5 years worth of trade has told me that I always tend to suffer a loss of 2% on average every single year, then I'll make a provision immediately of 2%. And that's it. I don't need to go any further than that. The fact that my history tells me that would be basis enough to enable me to say, well, this is what I'm basing it on. And even when I look at what's happening going forward, I don't see a substantial deterioration in the economic environment in Cambodia for me to be able for me to warrant increasing that provision from 2%. Or you might take the view that says, well, actually, we do see a deterioration in the economic conditions. So even though the last 5 years tell us 2%, we are now going to go and increase that 2% to 3%. Because in years where we've had high interest rates, we've had high inflation, we've had low economic growth, we've seen that the losses that we suffer tend to increase in those years. Our history has given us that information. And where that doesn't happen, we tend to need to increase our provisioning by 40, 50%. So 50% on 2% would take me to 3%. So that's why I'm using that number. We can certainly do that. That would be permissible. And again, you are able to justify why you've done what you've done. If you're looking at trade receivables, which do have a significant financing component, or are going to be outstanding for longer than a year, then the standard then says to us, in that situation, you may, if you choose to, apply the what's it, a loss allowance that's equal to the lifetime expected credit losses. But your situation may warrant that you do something different. It may warrant that you apply a much more robust model to determine what your expected credit losses are going to be. Or you find yourself in a situation like we got in the last one, where you've got lease receivables coming out of IFRS 16. So if that is the case, standard says, well, again, you may choose to apply lifetime expected credit losses, but if they're complicated and there's a lot that needs to go into it, maybe a much more robust model, the general approach might be the way to go. Look, it's up to you. You make the call, because this gives you options. But the first one is the one that says, well, don't have to. You don't have to go and do anything else. You can apply this with no issues at all, and we'll be okay with the answers that you come up with. So where you do apply this simplified approach, you can use what we call a provision matrix. And I guess IFRS 9, in its example, in giving us a provision matrix, then give us actual numbers. But those numbers are meant to be an example. They're not meant to be for anything that is 30 days and above. Use 30 days and below, use 2% or use 1%. Everything that's above that, use 2%. That was not the intention. It was simply an example. So just to point that out before we take that as being, that's what the standard says, so therefore that's what we must do. IFRS 9 does not say how to estimate lifetime ECLs, but it does permit the use of practical expedients such as a provision matrix. And it says, when you're using this provision matrix, if you then go and put your debtors into age bands, if I've got debtors that are sitting in current, 30 to 60 days, 60 to 90 days, 90 to 120, 120 plus, I might say, well, given what I know about my customers, generally speaking, because I give my customers 15 days to pay or 30 days to pay from the date of invoice, most people pay me within that period. But I'll have the stragglers, I'll have the people that take a little bit longer than that. It does not necessarily mean that they are going to be bad. But I know that the longer that debtors are outstanding, the less likely it is that I will be able to recover what is due to me. So therefore, my provisioning will probably need to increase the longer outstanding people are. So I might take the view, for instance, that says, well, if I take the example like we've got over here, is that for my debtors that are sitting in current, that amounts to 50,000, guys that are sitting in 30 to 60, that amounts to 60,000 and so forth, I might take the view that says, given what I know about my debtors, my potential loss on those that are sitting in current is 0.5%. So therefore, I'll use 0.5% to apply that to the 50,000 to give me my provision. I'll do the same thing when I look at my 30 to 60 days people. If 1.5% of those people likely turn bad, then my provisioning will be based on 1.5%. And I'll do the same thing for my 60 to 90 days. 3% likely go bad. So therefore, I'll apply 3% to 25,000. And I'll do the same thing to my 18,000 if I think that the number there is going to be 20%. because the longer they're outstanding, maybe the higher the risk. So 20% is likely to be lost. 20% of 18,000 would be my provision. But I'm making a provision based on my expectation of lifetime expected credit losses based on the aging that I've got here. That's how I would then determine my expected credit losses. Like, I'm going to give you a case study now to have a look at that will pick up on exactly what I've just said now, and hopefully we'll be able to do it ourselves. So if you have a look at this, on 1 December 20x4, Ambush sold goods on credit to Trey for 600,000. Trey has a credit limit with Ambush of 60 days, credit terms with Ambush of 60 days. Ambush uses a predetermined matrix for the calculation of allowances for receivables as follows. And again, this would have been informed by their history. Anything that is not overdue, 1% is what they provide for. 1 to 30 days, 5%. 31 to 60 days, 15%. 61 to 90, 20%, and the 90 plus, 25%. We are then told here, Trey had not paid by 31 January 20x5, and so failed to comply with its credit terms. And Ambush learned that Trey was in serious cash flow difficulties due to the loss of a key customer, but have undertaken to make payment. So we're told here, disregard any sales tax implications. What are the entries that we would need to show in the books related to this arrangement, related to this, what we've been told here, at 1 December 20x4 and 31 January 20x5? Given what we're told here, sale of 600,000 was done on 1 December 20x4. What should we do? Let's give you a minute to think about it, and I'll take you through it. I'm hoping that we're making progress with it. So I'm going to go to the solution now. So we're told here, for trade receivables that don't have an IFRS 15 financing element to them, IFRS 9 allows us to use a simplified approach to providing for ECLs. So what we then do is that at that point, we then work out what are the loss allowances that would be necessary for any provisioning right at the, over the lifetime of this instrument, based on what we know at initial recognition. So we know on 1 December 20x4, we've made a sale. We're debiting trade receivables 600,000. We're crediting our revenue 600,000. No issues with that particular transaction. At that same date, we also told, based on our matrix, and here's our matrix here, where our debtors are not overdue, we normally expect a loss of 1%. So we'll immediately make a provision of 1%. Doesn't matter that we were comfortable that we'll be able to get our money from Trey, but we make a provision for 1% at that point, the minute we recognize that sale. So we're therefore going to record expected credit losses, 6,000, debit our allowance for receivables, 6,000. 1% of 600,000. So that's all being done on day one of entering into this transaction. Then if we go a month or 2 months later, Trey should now have paid us, but they haven't paid us. So we're now told, well, because Trey hasn't paid us, they're no longer in this 1% bracket. We're now going to move them into a different bracket. And again, if we go to what we have here, different bracket says, are our debtors 1 to 30 days past due? That's where Trey now is. Because Trey is now in that 1 to 30 days past due, we now need to make a provision based on that information. So for the matrix, Trey has moved into that 5% bracket as their 60-day credit limit has been exhausted. The fact that they've given us assurances that they will receive payment is of no consequence. We don't take that and say, well, that's gonna give us a different outcome in terms of our provisioning. No, we don't. We completely ignore that for now. So we then need to go and increase our provisioning. So we're not saying, well, 5% of 600,000 is going to be our provision. So 5% of 600,000 gives us what's the number that we get out of that? I don't think it's 24,000. I don't know why this number comes out as that. But if anybody's got a calculator close at hand, please just let us know what that amount is. But we look at 5% of 600,000. 5% of 600,000 will give us 30,000. There we go. It will give us 30,000. But because we already have a provision in our books of 6,000, that means we need to increase our provision by 24,000 to get to that 30,000. So therefore, we then debit expected credit losses 24,000. We credit expected allowances for receivables by the 24,000, and we're done. The fact that we find ourselves in a situation where, yes, these guys have got difficulties and so forth, all of that simply says to us, increase our provisioning because the quality of the data has changed. If we found ourselves in a situation where we now know that Trey is not going to be able to pay at all, then our provision would have had to increase substantially to almost mimic that 600,000 that they owe us. But for now, we simply make a provision for expected credit losses based on the information that we've got. And yes, it does take into consideration the fact that our assessment of them are that they may still be in a position where they're able to pay us. So that's why we haven't made a provision for the full amount of the loss that might likely be suffered. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm going to ask you to whip out your phones again for a moment. I've got a question for you that is coming up now. And in that question, I'd like to talk about undrawn facilities for a moment. Now, if I've got a scenario like this, I've got a credit card with the bank, limit is 2 million real, and I currently owe the bank 500,000. In assessing expected credit losses to be recognized, which amount should the bank consider? Now, if you, jeepers, I thought I put my QR code scanning thing on here. I forgot to do that. I apologize. But if you don't mind just doing it on by typing in, going to paulev.com, then golden window 397 / golden window 397. Let's see what responses we get on that. Apologies, I completely forgot to put that QR code on there. So when you get there, you can actually type in an amount. So is it 2 million? Is it 500,000? Is it 1.5 million? What is the number that we're looking at exactly? Is it a different number? If you've got your own number that you think that the amount should be, let me know. If you've got some words that you want to try and explain it, happy for you to go and do that as well, and use that to give me some responses. See, we've got some people coming in, got up to 12 responses so far, or 15 now. I jumped very quickly. Okay, I'm going to be a few more people. We did 150 before. Where is everybody? Thank you, Alessi's support. There's a link that's been shared on the chat for those of you who are still struggling to get onto the page to answer this question. If you go there, if you just click on that link, the last one, the paulev.com / golden window 397, that will allow you to go straight to the page that we need to get to in order to be able to respond to this. There we go. Now we seem to be making very quick progress. Let's see if we can get to 60 responses. we should be able to do more than that because there's 200 from what I can see, there's still 276 of us on the call as we speak at the moment. Let's do at least 20% of us. And my target will keep shifting because now we've hit 60, we can do 70. Somebody withdrew their answer. We went backwards for a moment then. Okay, another 7 and then we'll call it quits. Let's go to 75 and then we'll call it quits. Are there no takers? We are stuck at 70. Oh, there we go, 73 now. Another 2 people. One more person. There we go, thank you. All right, so let's have a look at what people are saying here. Oh, come on, what is this thing doing? And it's not letting me go to the answer. Okay, never mind. I don't know why it's not letting me see the answer, but all the same, thank you very much for participating. That was good. Whatever your responses are, I think without short of me going to the back end to have a look at what the responses are, it should have come up on its own. I don't know why it didn't. IFRS 9 says to us, because you have a facility in place, so you as bankers, you've given me as your customer a facility. So whether it be a loan facility, a credit card, whatever it is, the fact that you've given me a facility that I'm able to draw down on, there's a potential that I could at any point draw down on it. So my credit limit, I'm told here, is the 2 million real on my credit card. And even if I don't owe a single penny on it right now, but the fact of the matter is that I could face a financial difficulty today, and I could go and swipe on my credit card the entire 2 million, which would then mean that overnight, we are going from I owe you nothing to I owe you 2 million real. And therefore your potential loss then becomes the 2 million real. All because of a credit arrangement that you and I have got in place that allows me to draw down on that entire 2 million. You couldn't potentially stop me and say, well, because you've heard that I've got potential difficulties on a Friday, therefore you're going to cancel my credit agreement. But chances are it's probably going to entail a little bit more than that for you to be able to cancel my credit agreement with you. So the standard says, when it comes to overdraft facilities, credit cards, loan commitments, all those things, we need to apply the ECL thinking to those facilities as well, because the customer could draw down on those facilities literally overnight. So we don't look only at the 500,000 that the customer owes us. We also need to see what else can the customer draw down on the entire facility and use that as a basis for our provisioning. So the standard then says, well, if you find yourself on your undrawn facilities, if you find yourself in that situation where you're in stage 1, where the customer's credit risk has not increased significantly since the last time you assessed them or since you gave them the facility, then you only make a provision based on 12 months expected credit losses on the portion that you expect to be drawn down on within the next 12 months. So you're not looking back at your customer and you're looking at their usage of their facilities and so forth and say, well, based on their usage history, this is what I expect their drawdown is going to be. But like I said, is that if my limit with you is 2 million, and if I face difficulty and I'm likely to draw down on the entire 2 million whenever, based on my history and whenever I face difficulties in the past. And you can see that the economic difficulties that the country is going through, and therefore your customers are likely to draw down a lot more than they otherwise would, then that's the number that you would then use as a basis for your provisioning. If you find that maybe your customer's credit risk rating has changed over the years, there's been a significant shift over the years, significant increase in their credit risk, then we need to make a provision for our lifetime expected credit losses. So again, make a provision based on the portion that you expect to be drawn down on over the remaining life of that particular facility. So we expect that you're able to cancel the facility. In the meantime, again, during the period in which you expect you're able to cancel it, how much do you think your customer will be able to draw down on? That's the number that we need to then make a provision for. So we don't simply look at it and say, well, because the customer hasn't drawn down, so therefore we're not exposed to those losses. You are exposed to those losses because as your customer, I could go to the supermarket today, swipe all 2 million real if I need to make sure that I've got I've got enough food for my family for the next 6 months while I'm trying to figure out how things are going to work. Draw down on the whole amount just in case you shut me down, and that means that your exposure to me is now for the whole amount of the 2 million real. So just bear that in mind as you're making those provisions. So another case study that I'd like you to have a look at. Excuse me. At 31 October, Morgan Bank has approved a total of $20 million in overdraft facilities, which have not yet been drawn down on. It considers that 12 million is in stage 1, of which 6 million is expected to be drawn down on within the next 12 months, with a 2% probability of default over the next 12 months. 8 million is in stage 2 and is expected to be drawn down on over the remaining life of the facilities with a probability of default of 8%. What's required here is to calculate the additional allowance for the undrawn overdraft facilities that needs to be made by this entity. So again, if we go back to what we've just been talking about now with the credit cards, same concept. So we're told 12 million of this is in stage 1. So it'd only be looking at the next 12 months worth of losses. And we know that 6 million will likely be drawn down on. So therefore, we take 2% of 6 million. We make a provision for that. 8 million we're told is in stage 2. So for stage 2, we make a provision for lifetime expected credit losses. And we're told there, probability of default there is 8%. So we're taking 8% of 8 million. So we then make a provision for that. So our total provision that we then show in the books will then be the sum total of those two numbers, 760,000. And that's all that Morgan would then show for the undrawn portion of the overdraft facilities. They would have a separate provision for what's actually been drawn down on. So effectively, you've got two things that are coming into play here that they'll need to look at what's been drawn down on and what has not. And then you put those two provisions together, that's what then goes into your books as your provision for expected credit losses. And then you may find yourself in a situation where there's financial guarantees that are issued. And these often happen, parent company issues a guarantee to its subsidiary companies. And there's a potential that if the subsidiary company is unable to perform, that the bank might then call on the guarantee. Well, how does that then work? How does a parent company account for the guarantee that they've issued, that they've given on behalf of their subsidiary company? So the guarantee is essentially a promise that's been made by one organization that they will take care of the financial obligations of another organization should that entity not be able to meet its obligations. So the person that is given the guarantee is the guarantor. So in the books of the guarantor needs to assess what is the likelihood that the person that I've given the guarantee on behalf of will not be able to perform, and therefore I will be called upon to step in on their behalf. That's essentially what the guarantee contract is all about. So therefore, that entity, the guarantor, must recognize as a financial liability that guarantee when it issues it. And initially, that guarantee is then recorded in the books at fair value. And how you then determine what fair value is, you take the present value of the net contractual cash flows without the guarantee, and you take away from that the present value of the net contractual cash flows under this loan. The difference between those two numbers is what then gives us the fair value that the guarantor must account for in their books. Excuse me, I just need to clear my throat. That's what the guarantor needs to show in their books as being the amount of the obligation that they've got in their books. Now, I'm bringing this obligation into the books. What the standard then says to us is that at each reporting period, the financial guarantee contract must be measured at the higher of either the loss allowance amount or the initial amount of their guarantee, so the fair value of the guarantee, less any amortization of related to their guarantee. So you look at finance costs, less any interest that may have been paid to that point. So again, formula that we've got here that we just need to remember, that it needs to be accounted for. So if I was to give you a scenario like this, so you've got a company here, Einstein, at the start of the financial year to 30 November 2023, Einstein entered into a financial guarantee contract with a financial institution on behalf of one of its subsidiaries, committing it to repay the principal amount of 60 million if the subsidiary defaulted on any payments that are due. The terms of the loan are that the principal is to be repaid in 3 equal installments. Casey, this talks to your question earlier on, in 3 equal installments, with the first payment due in the 23 financial year. Einstein has not secured any compensation in return for giving the guarantee, but assessed that the resultant obligation had a fair value of 1.2 million. The guarantee is measured at fair value through profit or loss. The guarantee was given on the basis that it would probably not be called upon. On 30 June 2024, the subsidiary was having financial difficulties and has not paid the second installment of the principal. It is assessed that it is probable that the financial institution will now call upon the guarantee. Discounting is not material, so don't worry about that. And the fair value of the guarantee is higher than the loss allowance that's been determined in terms of IFRS 9. So already we told already something about this formula here that I shared with you earlier. So don't worry about the loss allowance because the loss allowance is higher than the initial amount, less the amortization. So explain how this transaction would be treated in the financial statements of Einstein. So in this scenario, given all we've been told about here, at initial recognition, that guarantee would have had to be recorded in the books of Einstein at its fair value. And we told that amount was 1.2 million. So we debit profit or loss 1.2 million. We would credit financial liabilities 1.2 million. So this is recording the fact that this guarantee is in place. At the next reporting date, we now need to go and have a look at this again. We told the subsidiary company was able to pay the first installment. So there was no issues there. So that would then mean that there is going to be a reduction in the amount of the obligation that would have been recorded at initial measurement. So a third of the loan has been paid back. So initially we recorded 1.2 million. A third of it has been paid back. So that means we must reduce the liability that we have by at least a third. So that's why you see in there, we're now debiting financial liabilities 400,000, crediting income statement 400,000. But in that same year that we're doing this, we also told, well, this subsidiary company is now not able to meet its obligations. And it now owes an amount, and it's likely to default on the entire amount of whatever is still outstanding. Initial obligation was 60 million, 20 million has been paid. So that means that we now have 40 million outstanding. So if this entity is going to default, then they're going to be defaulting on 40 million. We have a provision already in the books of 1.2 less 0.4, 800,000. So the difference between that 800,000 and the default amount of 40 million is 39.2 million. So therefore, Einstein in its books would therefore need to record the fact that they now have a liability that needs to be paid back of 40 million. So increase the 800,000 by 39.2 million. So I thought this was my laser was working, but 39.2 million to get us to 40 million. And the other side of the entry is sitting in income statement. So we show that as part of our profit or loss, 39.2 million. And we're done, home and away, home and away on this issue. Folks, are there any questions from anybody on this? Are we all understanding what it is that we're talking about here? Sorry, Casey, I've just seen your message now. But I think it's fine, but I think we'll move on from here. Right. Then one last case study that I'd like us to have a look at. On 1 January 28, Demoivre guarantees a $100,000 loan of Abraham, its subsidiary, with which Stanley Bank provided to Abraham for 3 years at a rate of 12%. Without the guarantee, Stanley Bank would have charged Abraham an interest rate of 15%. On 31 December, we're told the probability that Abraham will default on the loan in the next 12 months was, for 2028 was 2%, 29 was 3%. So on 31 December of each of those years. How should Demoivre treat the financial guarantee contract in its books, given what we've just been talking about now? Again, the same concept would then apply. Just give you a minute or so just to think about it. I'm going to, I guess I can't go back without you losing information, but I was going to try and do what Casey just told me to do. But it's fine. Have a think about that for a moment. Right, another 20 seconds, and I'll take you out of your misery. For those of you who are struggling with it, but I'm hoping you're not. Okay. So if we go back to some of the principles that we've got, we said we recognize a financial liability when the guarantee is issued. So initial measurement will always be at fair value, and then subsequent measurement, and then fair value in this scenario, we're looking at the present value. Fair value will then be the present value of the net contractual cash flows without the guarantee versus present value of net contractual cash flows under this particular loan. So with whatever guarantees have been issued. So because we told that in this scenario, there is a rate of interest that will be charged without a guarantee, 15%. There is a rate of interest that has been agreed upon because of the guarantee of 12%. That's going to make a difference in the cash flows that this entity might be exposed to. So therefore, that's what we're trying to determine in order for us to assess what fair value is. So the financial guarantee contract is initially measured at fair value, which is present value of all the cash flows without a guarantee, less present value of all the cash flows under the loan, given what it's just been agreed upon here. And we're told 100,000 is the loan, coupon rate is equal to the discount rate, and we know that our cash flows years 1 to 3, 15,000 being the interest that will need to be paid. And then in the end of year 3, we'll also have another amount of 100,000 being the capital that will need to be repaid. So therefore, if we're to use all this information that we've got and put it all into a table to try and calculate what the amounts are that we need to be recording in our books, cash flows under the loan will be, we need to pay 12% on 100,000 every single year for the next 3 years. $12% on 100,000 for the next 3 years. Then if we then discount that, applying a discount rate of 15% on those numbers, these are the numbers that we then get. In year 3, so in year 1, year 2, and in year 3, we also need to pay back the capital. So again, work out what the numbers will be, present valued. So you see the discount rate of 15%, that the square there would then allow me to take it to 2 years. and the cube there would allow me to take it to 3 years. Take all those cash flows, discount them, that gives me 93,150. So the fair value of the guarantee in this case would then be the discounting the loan using the true discount rate that has been given to me here. So then take my 100,000 less than 93 that I'm going to ultimately pay. That says to me the fair value of my guarantee is 6,850. So I've done my calculation of what the discount is going to be. I can record that in my books. How I record that in my books: debit my P&L 6,850, credit my liability 6,850, and that's it. So I'm recording my fair value of my guarantee at initial recognition, and I'll move on from there. Now, and if anybody has any questions on that, we're all fairly comfortable with that. If I move on to the next, what would the amortization table look like for the loan? There, because I've got an opening balance of 93,150, I've got a finance cost, which I'm told 39,773, interest that is being paid. We told what those numbers are. It's a 12,000, 12% interest, it's 12,000 every single year. That'll then give me my closing balance for that year. And I'll do exactly the same thing for the next year and so forth. And then every single year, I'll then have an amount that I'll then show as part of my amortization of the difference between on the carrying amount of my liability, to then bring that into my books as well. So in recording my financial guarantee at each reporting period subsequent to that, I then need to measure it at the higher of. I gave this to you before. The lowest loss allowance amount that I've got, and the initial amount that I recorded in my books, the fair value of the guarantee, less any amount of amortization that takes into consideration my finance costs and any interest that I need to pay on this instrument. So therefore, those amounts that I just calculated just now, the 1973 and the 2268, these are the amortization amounts that are relevant for the purposes of calculating all subsequent adjustments that I'll need to make to that initial measurement of my liability. So therefore, I've got my amortization table that I've calculated to give me those two amounts. Then at each reporting date, I need to compare what is the loss allowance and how does that compare against the amount that I initially recognized, less any amortization amount, less any amortization that I've calculated here. So the loss allowance that I've got 12 months ECL would be 2% of 100,000, in this case 2,000. Initial amount less my amortization would be 6,850 minus 1973, which says to me my liability should be 4,877. I'll then show the liability at the higher of the two amounts. So 2,000 versus 4,877. I go with the 4,877. That's the amount that I would then show in my books as my liability at each reporting date. So as the guarantor, I'd need to do this calculation every single year. And in doing this calculation every single year, principles be, measure my liability subsequently at the higher of those two things, either the loss allowance amount or the initial amount, less the amortization that I've got, to then give me what I should be showing in my box. So in this case, we came to that 4,877. So if I work with exactly the same facts again as this, but on 31 December 28, there is a significant increase in the risk that Abraham will default on the loan. Probability of default over the remaining life of the loan, which is 2 years, is now 25%. How does De Marvre account for this financial guarantee contract in their books at 31 December 28? Again, I'll give you a moment to give that some thought and see how we will then deal with that. Right, 20 seconds. Okay. So in this scenario, lifetime ECLs are now going to be 25% of 100,000, being the likely loss that we're going to suffer in this scenario. So that puts the likely losses, the ECL, lifetime ECLs at 25,000. Carrying amount of the liability would then need to be adjusted from whatever it is that we showed before. In this scenario, we had, see where have I got it? The amount is 6,850. I'm just trying to figure out where I've got it in my slides. But the amount that we'd recorded up until now would have been 6,850. So it's the sum total of what we initially recorded plus all the movements that we've had in the obligations since then. So show 6,850. The differential between the two is what we then need to increase our provisioning by. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the obligation that we need to show in the books at this reporting date will then need to reflect the likely losses that we're going to suffer. And we're told that that's 25% of 100,000. So we need to show 25,000. So we're increasing our provision so that it reflects that particular number. Folks, are there any questions from anybody? Don't see anything on the chat. But, I'll assume that everybody is fairly comfortable. Then one last thing that we want to talk about today is what happens if you buy a debtor's book where there's already impairment issues with the book. So you know that the person that is selling it to you is because they are struggling to collect themselves. But maybe you've got a function within your organization that allows you to go and you've got a team of people with baseball bats and you can go knocking on people's doors and you can collect. So that's why you're happy to go and happy to buy these debtors books from people, because you've got a system that allows you to go and collect as much as you can. So you pay next to nothing to acquire these debtors, and hopefully you will be able to recover something from them. So the standard says, well, if you've got these credit impaired financial assets that you bring onto the books, initial recognition of these assets will be a fair value. But remember, these assets that you've got can never be in stage one. They can never be performing because that's the reason why you bought them, is because they already are not performing. So chances are they're already in stage 3. They are going to have a detrimental impact on future cash flows, whatever the contractual cash flows are, but you are hoping that you paid less than the contractual cash flow, but you'll be able to get more than what you've actually paid. So things like maybe there's been a breach of covenants, there's been concessions that have been granted by whoever was owed the money initially, and maybe they've been given a little bit more time to pay, or maybe they've gone into bankruptcy. All these things have already occurred around these particular receivables. So that would already indicate to you that you are looking at something that is possibly in stage 3 in that spectrum of where the debtors sit. So if that is the case, then the standard then says, well, the accounting implications that we're looking at are, we need to recognize lifetime expected credit losses since initial recognition as part of our loss allowance. And if there's any changes, we take those changes to profit or loss. And then if there are any improvements that occur after initial recognition, well, we will record those as a favorable change, and they'll then be taken as an income statement adjustment. So whatever movements we have on this instrument will be recorded in our income statement. That's where they belong. So folks, can never be in stage 1. Chances are you'll probably only be in stage 3. And in recording it in your books at initial recognition, it would have been at fair value, whatever it is that you paid for it. But please just remember that we need to then go back and reassess every single reporting date. Is there a decline in the credit quality of these instruments as we've gone along? And if there has been a decline, we need to record that additional loss in our books immediately. And if it's an improvement like we've got in the green block there, take that improvement as an adjustment directly to profit or loss as well. When it comes to what we then show in our books in respect of all these instruments, we need to have disclosures that allow the users to understand what we have considered in determining the expected credit losses that we recognize. So we need a description of the inputs, the assumptions that we've used to measure our expected credit losses. We also need to have information that talks to enables us to paint a picture around the deterioration of or the improvement in the credit risk related to the financial instruments that we're dealing with. And you can provide these disclosures in the financial statements if you wish, or if you have a risk report that you provide together with your annual report, maybe include them in there. That could be another place where you could put them. Then that way you don't have duplication of efforts. What you don't want, especially for the larger businesses that have got a comprehensive annual report, is for you to then have duplication of efforts. I know your auditors will probably say to you, but this information belongs in the annual financial statements. But if I've got a risk report that I'm providing, I can very easily cross-reference the two if they're being presented together. If they're not being presented together, it makes it a little bit more challenging. But to the extent that the information is available, maybe it's available on a website, and you can provide a link in your annual report to where that information is stored, is housed, then that's fine. Happy for you to provide that link. And that way, anybody who's looking at it can then simply click on a link or have got access to that information immediately, so they know exactly where to go looking for it. That will work too. So folks, it's up to you in terms of how you then deal with it. For those of you who've got maybe the less complicated ECL models that you need to put together, you're not using the Black-Scholes model or one of the other fancy models. If you're looking at something that might help you with coming up with what your expected credit loss might be, happy for you to get hold of us. We have what we've developed as a tool. We call it the ECL calculator, the expected credit losses calculator. Or if you go to eclcalculator.com, you can see it on there. It'll allow you to input in your information, and it'll spit back a report at you that will allow you to provide all the disclosures that will be required in your financial statements as well. So it takes into consideration where in the world you are, where your customers are. If it's segregation of your customers and so forth, it allows you to go and do all of that and basically come up with a report that will allow you to then provide something to your auditors or to whoever who's asking credible information as to, well, what is it that we've considered, taking into consideration what is happening in our environment, what is happening in the jurisdictions in which we're operating. And if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, you could run a different report for different jurisdictions as well to enable you to come up with an appropriate answer. Folks, I don't know if anybody has any questions for me, but thank you very much for listening to me this morning and this afternoon to you, this evening now. I'm sure by the time we're done, it's still the evening for you guys. And thanks very much. And I hope that you have a great week ahead of you. If anybody has any questions, I'm still here. Happy to take any questions from you. Right, I do not see any questions coming through. Casey, shall I maybe hand back to you?
Well, Raymond, I would like to thank you very much for a very comprehensive review of expected credit losses under IFRS 9. And I very much appreciate all of the examples that you have spent a lot of effort and time to develop. And it's very helpful to review the financial guarantee contracts as well as the undrawn facilities. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to hear about eclcalculator.com. Is that the name of the website, eclcalculator.com?
Yes.
And that's fantastic to hear about such an innovation. And I hope that some of our participants here today will visit eclcalculator.com. And you are a very energetic and wonderful and engaging presenter, lecturer. Thank you very much for your time. And for all of our participants here, I see many former students, CAMED alumni, as well as a number of current students. So everyone here today, it's wonderful to see you and hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. And Raymond, please enjoy your Sunday afternoon, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you very much for the promotion as well. I see I've been promoted through all the comments that are coming through. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Raymond. And before we finish, I would like to invite everyone to do just a quick surveys on this workshop. I have just dropped the link in the chat box. Could you just click on that link and give us your feedback and comments so that we can make a better workshop next time? Please, just a few minutes.
And we can say goodbye, Raymond, and we will share the feedback from the students with you via email.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks.
Goodbye, Raymond. Goodbye, Casey.
Good.
All right, everyone. So could you please do me a favor by completing the survey, just a few minutes, a few seconds only, and we will share with the professor, Casey, and also Raymond about your feedback, about your comment, and then we will have another one in the future. And hopefully we will do better next time. Okay. Okay, thank you. If you have done it, thank you very much. You can just have a break and I will see you next time. Okay, if you are going to do the final exam on the 21st, I think 21st November, please do great review on that because the exam is gonna be difficult for you because some of you already have done the mock exam and then you already failed it. Okay, thank you, Suchitra, thank you very much. I hope everyone had a very productive learning today. Okay, goodbye everyone. If you have done the survey, please. I'm going to drop it again if you haven't done it because so many chatted here. Please just click on the link. Thank you, goodbye, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.